Water that flows along New Mexico's largest river, the Rio Grande, is managed by several states through long-held agreements or compacts. One of the most significant is called the Rio Grande Compact, and it affects users in the entire region.
The Rio Grande Compact was signed in 1938 by 3 states, New Mexico, Colorado, and Texas. It was then ratified by the legislature in each 3 states and finally adopted by Congress. Its purpose is to ensure that each state gets a flow of water in the Rio Grande. Not one state can simply hog all the water in the river. The amount of water to be distributed varies. In a normal year, Colorado delivers about 1/3 of the flows in the Rio Grande to the state of New Mexico. In a wet year, about 2/3 of the flow, and in a dry year, about 1/4 of the flows. New Mexico, in turn, must deliver to the Rio Grande project about 60% of the flows in a normal year. The Rio Grande project is a large irrigation project below Elephant Butte Reservoir. About 57% of the project is in New Mexico, and about 43% is in the state of Texas.
In any river basin, the Rio Grande, any other basin, there is native water. That's the water that belongs in the basin, that originated in the drainage basin as precipitation. And there's 2 kinds of that water. Direct flow, that's the water that would be in the stream without releases from reservoirs. And then there's storage water, water that is captured at the peak of the snowmelt runoff when nobody else needs it, when it's in excess of the direct flow needs. And then that stored water can be released later in the year, when the direct flow has dropped, and that storage water is used for the benefit of the people who own the water rights for that storage in the reservoirs behind the dams. There's also imported water. And on the Rio Grande, the example of that is the San Juan Chama Diversion Project water. That's water that is brought through a tunnel under the Continental Divide from the Colorado River drainage. And it's water that wouldn't be in the basin without the works of man, and particular owners have a right to use that water.
There are a series of gauges along the river. One of them is the waterway gauging station just south of Espanola. Measurements taken at the station determine how much water must be delivered to users downriver under terms of the compact. Failure to make deliveries has resulted in one U.S. Supreme Court lawsuit brought by Texas and New Mexico to protest Colorado's under-delivery of compact water. Ultimately, that lawsuit was dismissed. For most of the last 2 decades, each state has met its compact obligations. Making sure that water is managed fairly is the job of the state engineer.
Stream flow measurements vary from year to year, depending upon the weather. And during a time of a drought, the ability of New Mexico to deliver water becomes more and more challenging.
One of the determining factors in meeting compact obligations is the prior appropriation doctrine contained in the state's constitution, which says that during times of drought, the state engineer provides water to those water right holders who made the earliest appropriations for beneficial use.
During a drought, the priority administration doctrine directs me to administer water rights by senior and junior water rights. A senior water right, for instance, one that was put to first beneficial use in 1830, would get the water in the time of a drought, whereas a very junior water right, for instance, one that was dated 1990, would possibly get curtailed. Article 7 is found in the Rio Grande Compact. It says that when the water level in Elephant Butte drops below a certain point, it triggers certain storage restrictions upstream. Actually, it says that when there is less than 400,000 acre-feet of usable project storage water in Elephant Butte, reservoirs that were constructed after 1929, water storage can no longer be increased in those reservoirs. This is going to have a major impact this year on El Vado Reservoir, as well as the city of Santa Fe's reservoirs up Santa Fe Canyon.
This graph shows historical levels of usable water in storage at Elephant Butte. You can see the amount was below the 400,000 acre-foot level for most of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, making it difficult to meet provisions of the Rio Grande Compact. During several consecutive years in the mid-1980s, however, this reservoir was filled to capacity of more than 2 million acre-feet, a stark contrast to current levels that are around 200,000 acre-feet, with much of the area that used to be underwater now becoming a muddy marsh.
If we get lots of snow, unfortunately, we're not in the clear. It's going to take a lot of snow, both in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, to fill up Elephant Butte Reservoir. This means that the state engineer is going to be put in the difficult position of administering priorities in northern New Mexico so that it can meet its compact obligations to serve water users in southern New Mexico as well as in Texas.
To understand the various forces competing with the state engineer's ability to meet Rio Grande Compact obligations, it is useful to take a look at the river's path. The Rio Grande's path begins in southern Colorado. Users in the San Luis Valley are entitled to divert water for their purposes before it begins its journey south into New Mexico. After traveling through a series of tunnels, water from the upper Colorado Basin is transported under the Continental Divide and emerges to the surface on Willow Creek, near Dulce, New Mexico. From here, it flows into Heron Reservoir, built in 1971 to store water for contractors including the cities of Santa Fe and Albuquerque, among others. Water released from Heron Reservoir enters the Rio Chama riverbed and flows into El Vado Reservoir. This reservoir was completed in 1935 by the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District to capture surplus flows of the Rio Chama during the spring and then release them for use by irrigators in the Middle Rio Grande Valley, as well as 6 Pueblo Indian tribes who irrigate from it. The federal government will be storing water at El Vado to ensure the supply for pueblos along the Middle Rio Grande. Those Indian communities include Cochiti, Santo Domingo, San Felipe, Santa Ana, Sandia, and Isleta, which comprise almost 9,000 acres of Pueblo lands. These pueblos were promised water allocation through the 1928 Act of Congress, which authorizes the Secretary of the Interior to enter into an agreement with the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District. New Mexico's pueblos and tribes are among the state's senior water rights holders.
Native Americans are sovereign nations.
Santo Domingo tribal member Ernest Horis.
We're a little different from the reservation Indians that have a treaty with the United States. We don't have a treaty with the United States. We had a treaty with the Spanish, and when the Mexicans took over from the Spanish, the part of the treaty between Spain and Mexico, Mexico had to live up by those treaties that the Spanish made. When the United States took over from Mexico, they in turn had to live by those prior arrangements. And those arrangements had to do with land and natural resources and water. So our sovereignty actually comes to the Pueblo Indians by a foreign government, Spain, Mexico, and now the United States.
We're in the process of initiating adjudications. An adjudication determines how much water a person owns. An Indian Pueblo or tribe will be adjudicated a water right, simply like everybody else. I would imagine that ultimately the debate will shift from how much water an Indian Pueblo is entitled to, and it will shift to defining the role of the tribes in water administration and development.
Some of that development includes casinos and hotels to house visitors. In fact, most of the state's 19 pueblos are investing in economic development.
So what Native American people have begun to do is to develop their resources, and by developing, taking their water and now putting it to use where they can gain some economical benefit. And the state, again, benefits by this development because of labor, because of tax, employment tax. And so there are a lot of benefits to those cities that reside near those reservations that have business.
Once a water right has been granted, it has the status of a vested property right as long as it is used in accordance with the terms of the permit, and it can be sold, leased, or traded freely. The idea of water marketing is not popular among acequia users, or parciantes, who believe the acequias are the essence of the Hispanic culture of New Mexico.
I used to tell people, I used to tell them, don't sell your water rights, don't sell your land, unless, it's a must, that something drastic happened in the family that you just can't borrow money or that you're against the wall. Because once we sell that, it changes the whole complexity of your life, your community, the state, the region.
Even before water leaves El Vado on its way to Abiquiu Dam, its destination is the target of varying interests. This reservoir, Abiquiu, is the main flood control structure that's used when the flow in the Rio Chama approaches potentially damaging magnitudes. Flooding hasn't occurred since the mid-90s, and current levels are extremely low. It is also where users such as the city of Albuquerque store San Juan Chama project water.
From Abiquiu Reservoir, the Rio Chama meanders southward 35 miles toward the Espanola Valley, where irrigators have diverted some of the water for centuries. The Rio Chama meets the Rio Grande here at Espanola. Thanks to rehabilitation efforts of replacing rock and brush dams with permanent structures, flooding is minimized, so there is an adequate amount of water for users downstream.
From Espanola, the Rio Grande winds its way southward 200 miles before it reaches Elephant Butte Reservoir.
In the middle reach of the Rio Grande, the river used to meander. It has now been highly channelized. In many areas, the Rio Grande's face and its course have changed. You can actually see where the river ends south of Saguaro. We are now in the process of cleaning out some of the silt and the sand, reshaping the channel to ensure the flow from northern New Mexico gets into Elephant Butte Reservoir. Once it is in Elephant Butte Reservoir, it will be released so that it can efficiently serve communities in southern New Mexico as well as Texas and Mexico.
Another variable making it difficult for the state engineer to meet obligations of the Rio Grande Compact is the Navajo Dam.
In the north, Navajo Reservoir provides water for the Navajo Indian Irrigation Project, as well as certain large industrial uses. Because of the severe drought affecting New Mexico, there is much less water coming into Navajo Reservoir than is flowing out. In fact, experts are predicting that by July of this next year, there is a 1 in 8 chance that the reservoir level will fall below the elevation of the inlet pipe that diverts water into the Navajo Indian Irrigation Project. If this does occur, the Navajo Nation has written a letter to the Secretary of the Department of Interior asking that shortage sharing be initiated. This means that waters would be shared between the Navajo Indian Irrigation Project and the San Juan Chama project. This shortage sharing will have an impact on the contract users out of Heron Reservoir, which includes Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Espanola, and the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District.
In the past, flooding was a problem in the Middle Rio Grande Valley. Under the Flood Control Act of 1960, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began construction of Cochiti Dam as a flood control measure. When it was completed in 1976, it was one of the 10 largest earth dams in the United States. The dam is operated with the primary goal of releasing the stored water as quickly as possible without causing downstream damage. In addition to flood control, Cochiti is also a recreational pool. Early water management efforts in the Rio Grande Basin were driven by the needs of agriculture. But today, municipalities are growing and looking for ways to serve their increasing populations.
The city of Albuquerque is growing. Its population is almost 750,000 people now. The city wants to build a new diversion structure on the Rio Grande to divert their San Juan Chama water. That application is now before a state engineer hearing officer. The state engineer will ultimately act on that application and take into consideration, before he approves the permit, whether the permit impairs existing water rights or is contrary to the public welfare or the conservation of water within the state?
Well, it benefits it in a couple of fundamental ways, the most important of which is it reduces the city's mining of groundwater. And mining of groundwater is adverse to almost any conservation ethic you can think of. The state engineer has said it, everyone's agreed. We shouldn't be mining groundwater, we should be going to a sustainable resource. This is sustainable. Environmental movement is built on sustainability. This is sustainable.
It's absolutely essential that Albuquerque access this water, because if it doesn't, Albuquerque will not be able to sustain the water supply that it has, number one, and number two, the groundwater reserves, which really ought to be a drought reserve, will be consumed, by the day-to-day, year-to-year use of the citizens, and then that option for water management will be foreclosed.
The problem that cities have is, where do we get the water we need to grow? Increasingly, the idea of water marketing, which has been used over the last century, has been utilized. Basically, water marketing is a form of voluntary transfer of water from one use to another.
One of those cities is Rio Rancho, a sprawling city of about 53,000, located just northwest of Albuquerque, whose officials are negotiating with water rights holders in the region to lease water rights for the future.
Well, we're excited about this particular opportunity to use lease rights, which we've come to with an agreement with the state engineer's office, because it means that we can sustain then our growth here in Rio Rancho, because it allows us then to use those leased rights specifically for parks and playing fields, and then frees up our permanent water rights for our continuing construction, which means to us about 3,000 new members to our community every year. And that's pretty exciting for us, and it's the first time in New Mexico.
But for acequia users like Will